Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get this thing kicked off. So I'm Dr. Cain Elliot. I'm the head legal futurist with Filevine. And today I'm really excited. I'm going to be talking with Nikki Easterday, who's with the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund and the staff attorney over there. I just want to let everyone know, like we always do with these webinars, we'd like to encourage your Q&A. So we're here today to talk with Nikki and the team about what they do over at TLDEF. And so if you guys have questions during our conversation, please hit up that Q&A. We'd love to hear from you and be able to answer that and answer questions you may have about the organization or their legal work, what they're thinking about the legal landscape and the space they work in. That's what today is all about for learning purposes. So please do ask, and I'll just tell everyone, as with anything, if you're having a question, you're not sure if you should ask, go ahead and ask. It means someone else has the same question. They just haven't decided to go ahead and speak up to ask yet. So please do engage with us in that way. We'd love to hear from anyone who's on. This is also a fun and special event for us. We wanted to do this webinar this month for Pride Month at the organization. I'm also the executive sponsor of the Pride Committee. It's an important thing for lots of Viners and the people in our organization as well. And the most important thing for us is places where we can bring the work together, what Filevine does in work supporting the legal community and hoping to build better tools for the legal community. Anytime we can bring that together with things that are personally impactful for Fileviners themselves and for how they live and embody themselves in the world, that's kind of the best thing, especially when we can do that with clients and partners we're working with. So with that, I just say to Nikki, thanks for joining. Really do appreciate you giving us your time today and joining with us. I thought maybe it would be nice if you could start, Nikki, by telling us a bit about yourself and how you got started in this work.
Yeah, thank you. So I came out to New York for law school. I'm an alumni of CUNY School of Law, which is sort of a public interest program. Not even sort of, that's what it is. And then immediately after graduating, I was working as a consultant with the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, so CMS, on the implementation of the ACA, or the Affordable Care Act. From there, I then joined New York's Consumer Assistance Program, which is called Community Health Advocates. And there is where I picked up and developed a practice around helping New Yorkers access gender-affirming care through health insurance, which also involved some policy work and some lobbying efforts, one of which was, well, it took about 5 years, but we effectively got New York to regulate insurance documents in an effective way to ensure that folks, regardless of the type of coverage they have, can in fact access the wide spectrum of medical care that constitutes gender-affirming care. While I was there, I also helped develop and build and run the state ombuds program for accessing mental health and substance use disorder services through insurance. So that's called CHAMP, which is like a very long acronym. So CHAMP and CHA. And then having done the work there, I joined TLDEF in October of last year. Sorry, TLDEF, which is how we pronounce the acronym TLDEF for Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Sounds a lot like TLDEF, which is a way to remember it, I suppose. So I joined the Trans Health Project at TLDEF, bringing sort of my extensive work around challenging insurance companies to provide care and sort of a robust understanding of the minutia of how health insurance and health law works across programs and in the United States. And so predominantly, my work is around accessing gender-affirming care, because I work almost exclusively within the Trans Health Project.
Okay. Well, and if you could continue on that. So it sounds like you've got more than enough background in administrative law and work with CMS, which is, I know a lot of our clients, no matter what space they're in, end up encountering at some point, which is its own kind of like maze to figure out. So that's pretty awesome. But I was wondering if you could tell us just generally about the organization and the kind of legal work that the organization as a whole is engaged in. I know you talked about what area of it you're specializing in and focusing on, but if you could talk about in general, what people should know about the organization and its background.
Absolutely. So TLDEF was founded in 2003 as an organization dedicated towards eliminating discrimination against trans folks and sort of working towards trans and non-binary equity. Just for the purposes of this webinar, if I say trans, it's the most inclusive umbrella of that term. So it includes non-binary and sort of anyone who is gender diverse, just as sort of a shorthand. So I'm not just spewing acronyms constantly.
Okay.
So there's sort of three, I would say there's like three primary focuses at TLDEF. So one is our signature name change program, which does phenomenal work, which is largely around connecting folks with pro bono attorneys to effectuate a legal name change, which I can get into in a little bit more, but I'll just give you the overview first, but it's like a profound resource. We also do impact litigation. We've done impact litigation around health, but also we are working increasingly in the carceral setting. So we're in Miami-Dade, we are representing folks who were incarcerated and subjected to discriminatory practices in the way that they were processed through booking. So we tend to try to look at everywhere that trans folks are experiencing discrimination across a variety of fields, and then our impact litigation is focused on addressing those issues. Some of the sort of perennial constant needs are, of course, legal name change and document requests, access to healthcare, and then because trans folks particularly trans folks of color, are disproportionately incarcerated, which is largely due to the ways in which poverty is criminalized in this country. We are increasingly working in carceral spaces. So we have impact litigation, name change, trans health are sort of our three big programs. And our sort of three big focuses. We're also pushing more into or developing and discussing more about how to effectively engage in education campaigns and other ways to sort of bring our subject matter expertise to a wider platform. So ways in which we can, despite being a relatively small firm or organization, how we can sort of maximize our effect. I think that's sort of, hopefully that's a broad overview.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So when we talk about TLDEF or TLDEF, we'll make sure everybody who attended gets a link to this, and we'll have some follow-up from you guys so you can find out more about the organization, find out how you can impact and contribute to the work of the organization. But one of the things you're describing, I think, is something that impacts all of our clients in different spaces, whether they're in civil rights work, whether they're in administrative law. This week, I'm out at a conference that's for corporate counsel work. I think everybody in legal work at some point, one way I would say it is, if you don't feel like you're understaffed, you're probably not working in legal, right? So this is a kind of universal experience, but I'm wondering, so at TLDEF, when you talk about this impact litigation work, how do you decide, and how do you guys decide which work are we going to take, especially when it's work that's motivated by, you guys are a nonprofit, you're working for a specific cause, for, justice and equity, for specific groups that are historically underserved too with legal representation. So you're motivated in a very particular way, but it's the same universal problem, whatever the motivation and source is coming from, which is, how the hell do we do this with the number of people we have? So I'm wondering, Nikki, like, what are the kinds of ways, or how do you guys put together a matrix of, we're doing this project, we're not doing this? How do you decide cases you're taking and not, when I'm sure, like everybody, you'd like to take them all if you could? So how do you guys make that determination? What goes into that?
Fantastic question. So one of the primary ways that we find cases, right, is, so our name change project, which I'm going to talk a lot about because, again, it's our signature piece, right, has helped a huge number of people across the country access legal name changes. And so some of our impact litigation actually comes out of name changes, right? So we'll get contacted by someone who's like, hey, in my state, I have to undergo a specific surgery in order to change my name, or I'm incarcerated, so I'm prevented from changing my name, right? And so we will look at those and be like, okay, those are systemic barriers, right? That we know that the person who's reaching out to us, this is not a singular individual issue. This is a systemic process. So we're like, okay, let's go after that, right? Like we know that if there's a requirement for surgery to change your name, that affects everyone. So let's go after that, right? And similarly with folks who are incarcerated. So one of the things that I really like about TLDEF, what we do sort of operationally, is we make a profound use of pro bono co-counsel, right? So we're nationally recognized as an organization, but that doesn't mean that we have folks who are licensed to practice in every state. And again, we're a small shop, so we don't have the same kind of funding and resources. So one of the things that we'll do, in addition to sort of collaborating with other LGBT civil rights orgs or other trans civil rights orgs, is we have a very strong pro bono system in place, and sort of a pro bono, sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister, a pro bono program, where we're able to work with larger firms who are interested in doing pro bono work, who have greater resources and capacity and staffing than we do. So as we bring subject matter expertise, trans competency, which I think is incredibly important, particularly working in this space, and we're able to marry that with larger firms' resource. So we're able to take on, I would say, issues and litigation that is, at first blush, far beyond the actual capacity of that our staffing would suggest. In terms about how we make those decisions, I mean, I think we look, as all impact litigation does, does this implicate a wide range of people, right? Because we do have limited capacity. And yes, the desire that I have to fix every single intake that comes in through our various intake sources is profound. And it's been quite difficult to be like, I actually have to let this one go. Yeah. Because particularly coming from a direct legal service background, in some capacities where we just take everyone, it's challenging. But yeah, we look at, does this broadly affect folks? And then also, does this also predominantly affect like the most marginalized in our community, right? Which is, part of our sort of matrix, if you will, is essentially like a value statement, and also sort of like an analysis of who's the most vulnerable in our community, what issues are they most likely to experience, and then how can we leverage that, our processes to address that. So it's looking at folks in the South, it's looking at trans folks of color, right? It's like looking at essentially folks who are most likely to be economically displaced or houseless, who are most likely to be over-policed or over-criminalized. So those are, we try to focus our work in that venue. That doesn't mean, we also take cases that don't necessarily fit that matrix, but we think would still provide value for the overall trans community.
Nikki, here's the tech nerd part of me coming out. I'm just wondering, do you guys use any kind of like matrix where you're scoring it along those, or is it more just like a check off of this is what it seems to hit? I'm just curious if that's.
Yeah. So we have like internal written documents that sort of reflect a consensus that we've come to around what our values are and our priorities and where we want to put our time. That's something that I would say is pretty much constantly, it's not static. It's something that we, I think, on a pretty routine basis are revisiting and revising as the legal landscape shifts and as our work shifts, and as we get information from that. So it's less of a cool matrix and like a principles or like a guidelines document. And then because we're a small enough team, our whole legal team meets pretty routinely, and we kind of like have ongoing conversations about, hey, like this, I caught this case, or I've heard about this, this is an intake we had. What are our thoughts on this? Or, it's more informal.
By the way, if you guys want to hit me and the team up afterwards about a matrix like that, my team and we built one like that for a group that works in criminal defense for incarcerated prisoners, so they could help triage that also. It makes it a little bit more impersonal, but then help them also to kind of take out, like you said, the feeling of, oh, we want to do this and help this person, but also we know we have limited resources. So I'm wondering, okay, so when you guys are doing that, we've talked a couple times about the name change project, and I'd like us to give a little bit more in depth, if we could, about what that is, the background behind it, where it came from. And I know that it's regarded as kind of, your premier program. If I look at literature about you guys, I see that as one of the first things listed. So where did that come from? And then maybe you could also, for people who are attending and don't sit and, stalk your website on Google the way I've done, what is it about? What are the mechanisms of it? And especially because this will go out not just to the attendees who are really pleased to have today on, but those who might be interested in the subject, who are part of the broader fileverse, as I call it, who are with the legal side. If you could talk about like the legal mechanics of what's going on. So
yeah. Fantastic. So the name change project, like a lot of the stuff I would say at TLDEF started out as one of the, because we used to be even smaller than we are now, started out with just one attorney just doing name changes, right? And then was like, okay, like I know how to do this. How do we scale this out? And then it became, through scaling out, our sort of premier signature project. So what TLDEF does is we're the focal point where intakes happen. We essentially screen those folks and walk them. We do pretty detailed intakes, and then we refer them to a pro bono attorney that's been, part of our system, to actually complete the name change process in that state or county, et cetera, of where they are.
But Nikki, before you jump in, I would hope if we could take it even a step back and just so for people who are joining us who say, why is name change something that's critical, that comes up for the trans community? What's important about a name change?
Got it.
Context.
Yes.
Start there about why is that impactful in someone's life? Why is it an important issue?
I appreciate that. Sometimes forget to walk it back to oh yeah, we're not all part of the trans community and really in depth in this. Okay, so most trans folks have different names than the ones that they were given at birth. And it often reflects their new gender identity, their new identity in general. It's a profoundly affirming thing to have your own chosen name. It becomes tricky because we live in a deeply administrative society in which we are in many ways sort of tracked or defined legally by a wide constellation of documents and legal documents, which if there are inconsistencies between the names on those documents, create administrative hurdles from accessing benefits, background checks, etc. Right? So not only is it, I think, individually affirming, it also completing a name change, a legal name change, and having all of your records updated means that when a trans person moves through the world, everything that agencies and anything that would access this type of information is going to see the correct name and is going to refer to that person by the correct name and not their previous name, which is commonly referred to as a dead name, which you should not refer to people by. Don't refer to trans people by their dead name. And if you're working with trans folks, ask them what their name is. And if you need to know about the dead name, ask, are there other names in your legal documents that you used previously, right? Without being what's your real name? That's just a little 101, I'm going to sneak that in there. So it's, but things like accessing bank accounts or setting up bank accounts, really anything in which you've ever been required to put down a social security number, anything where you've had to write your name on a form, those are points of conflict for trans folks, right? It also extends to gender markers, which is part of, but separate from the name change project, is part of that general process, right? Is trying to have a unified set of documents that accurately reflect who you are. And so that's sort of the reason why it's really important. And both, I think, individually and and sort of just administratively, it becomes a nightmare. There are also, the name change process is confusing to lay folks, right? It can be expensive, it can be confusing, it can, and there are a wide variety of different processes and rules in place, some of which are really transphobic, again, requiring bottom surgery, that's genital surgery, in order to get a name change. is grossly transphobic because not all trans people get bottom surgery. Not all trans people want bottom surgery. The idea that surgery or certain medical interventions are necessary to hold a transgender identity is not something that's endorsed by the majority of the trans community, and is like not something that certainly should be a legal requirement because it's inaccurate to like how trans people move through the world. Yeah, and so then there's, yeah, of course, there's like those barriers, which is why being able to connect trans folks with attorneys who can file those name changes is sort of like of paramount. I'll also say, you know, before I joined TLDEF, I was talking to a lot of my community and my friends and my colleagues, and I was like, oh, hey, you know, I want to, like, I've heard great things about TLDEF. I want to, you know, I'm applying there. Everyone I spoke to was like, oh yeah, they're great. They did my name change. Like, I don't actually know anyone who got a name change not through TLDEF at least in New York, right? So,
and so Nikki, I'm just wondering, so you're like, the really important thing that you're describing then is this network effect that you can get people in touch with people. I would guess that's because, and I'd like your clarification on this, but I'm guessing that's because all of the different jurisdictions that people are living in, they're just multiplication of different rules, circumstances, and ways that things are happening and working.
Yeah, there's essentially like no uniformity. It's state by state, it's county by county. There's really like no uniformity. And some states, you know, require things like oh God, what is it? It's like notice and publication, which is particular.
Yeah, when I was in Philadelphia, I think when you do a name change, you need something that's in a public reference, like as if people still read newspapers, but you need a publication somewhere.
Yeah, and a lot of those, like, you know, reach way back. Like a lot of those rules come way back from prior to like the information age, where it's like, I think was the idea that they didn't want folks just like moving to a different state, changing their name, and then escaping all their creditors in like the 1800s. But it's like, that's not, we don't live, you know, despite what the Supreme Court might suggest, we no longer live in the 1800s. So yeah, it's also particularly dangerous for trans folks, right? Like it is publicly outing trans people at a time of, yep, I think it's in the chat, surely raises huge safety issues. The answer to that is absolutely, right? Transphobic violence is on the rise and is all, you know, and prior to even being on the rise is quite high. And forcing trans folks to like out themselves in a public manner is dangerous. New York no longer requires that, which is great, but it does in other states. Yeah, and you know, one of the things is to also, I think, important to flag is about 70% of our applicants are below the federal poverty line, right? So if you think about the ways in which poverty is criminalized in this country, and also the ways in which accessing any kind of benefits is like deeply means tested and also deeply administrative, right? If you're below the poverty line, you need to access SNAP, right? Like there are services in some, you know, to varying degrees, and accessing those are deeply administrative, where something like having incongruent names might, you know, get your SNAP application denied, right? So, and then these are also, I mean, you know, if 70% of the people who are coming to us are below the federal poverty line, and the federal poverty line is not a livable line, right? I mean, you can easily be 200 plus of the federal poverty line and still be, by anyone's working definition, poor. But so 70%. I think
everyone on the call is knows, in wherever you are, rent means there's issues, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I saw someone post online. It turns out the guy in New York who was saying the rent was too damn high, like he was right all along.
Yeah. I mean, there was nothing wrong. Like there was no lie to that statement. Like there was like, yes, that is true. Yeah, so most of our applicants are below the federal poverty line, and the majority are people of color, which is, so we're really talking about like the most vulnerable segment of the trans community are the overwhelming majority of the folks who we serve through our name change project, which I think gives it, you know, a tremendous value. And it's also, you know, one of the things that I'm really proud of the name change project is it makes it super easy for pro bono and attorneys to be involved. If you're part of this network, if you've been sort of like trained and you're part of the network, which is again quite easy, if you get a name change case, we essentially just send you the form with the information already in it. You just have to verify it with the client and then submit it. So we're, it's very, very low barrier of entry for attorneys who are interested in doing this work.
And Nikki, subsequent to this webinar, if anybody's attended or ends up viewing the video of this, who's an attorney who would like to get involved, so they reach out to your organization, and it's easy thing to facilitate.
Yeah, just email namechange@transgenderlegal.org. Sorry. Which is like, if you go onto our website, TLDEF.org, and you look at name change, like there's an email address. But yeah, just namechange@transgenderlegal.org. We'll get you there as well. Failing that, if you email me or anyone, like, again, we're small enough that we'll direct you to the right place. I think someone reached out to me on LinkedIn, and I was like, great, email me here and I'll forward it to the folks who are running that program.
Great.
And I'll also say, if there just one, if you don't mind, I know we want to keep on that. If there are firms that want to be involved, right? So we're talking like 10 to 12 plus people, like we will also set up a Trans 101 training plus a state specific legal training. If you're like, hey, we're a firm, we want to do this, this is where we want to put our pro bono work, we'll help you do that, right? And I've seen, and I've done a lot of Trans 101 trainings. I really like the one that the Name Change Project does, and I think it's a bare minimum that if you want to move into the space, to have a certain level of trans competency. And I think, again, I appreciate that the Name Change Project is like, we know that you may not be coming at this with a ton of background. We'll help get you there. So
no, that's great. That puts an emphasis on the education fund part of the name. I know we're focusing on legal with our audience and the background of our company, but that's really important to mention. I was wondering, Nikki, this is kind of a broader question here, so you can take this any direction you want. But I was wondering, so litigation about trans people, it seems to be in serious flux, things going on state, regional levels all the time. My first question, before just asking you in general what's going on in that landscape, because that may be too big to address, but how do you guys keep track of that? Like, one of the things I'm always interested in is how people in different legal domains can aggregate the information coming in, make sure their team's up to date with things that are changing all the time. Like, what do you guys do? Do you have, is there a chat thread where you're just collecting endless sets of new litigation and new legislative precedent that's coming? Like, what are you guys tracking and watching to keep up to date on your own work?
Yeah, it is difficult, right? In this year alone, the amount of like anti-trans legislation, trying to keep track of the state legislative sessions was huge. As a growing organization, we're building certain things. We're also building out our policy sort of wing, which is, become increasingly evident of like a need. But one of the things that's helpful about this work is we work in collaboration, not only with pro bono organizations, but we work in collaboration with other trans and LGBT organizations. So tracking the state legislation, like, I think, if you have a cool matrix for that, I also would like to talk to you about cool matrices, both for, I think our intake would benefit, and then also for this. But I sit on a state policy working group, where every week we were meeting and discussing every new piece of legislation that came up, the status of where they were, that also like pushes out notes following that. So that was like a way of tracking it. It's difficult. There's a lot happening kind of all at once, particularly during state legislative sessions. It's sort of like we gear up for, there's going to be an onslaught. So it's, we sit on a lot of, I'm not the only one. We sit on a lot of different, like sort of community org, like we work like a lot of networking groups and a lot of like working groups, right? So to kind of
any good listservs. I'm just saying, legal is one of the only places where listservs are still the thing where a lot of stuff happens and information gets shared. I always try to explain to like younger colleagues about listservs that are not in legal, and it's always like, no, you're letting everyone in a community spam your email box. But it kind of works sometimes. I'm just wondering. Yeah.
There are, listservs and fax machines, right? Like we're keeping it down with like old tech, right? But yeah, listservs. I will, yeah, I don't know like the actual name of those listservs like off the
Yeah.
top of my head because I don't typically look at that. And like I'm just like, oh yeah, this one. But yeah, there are, and I'm happy to circulate some good listservs. A lot of them are sort of, whatever working group we're sitting on, so federal, state equality, federal equality ones, state equality ones, state policy stuff, like those are often also have a listserv attached to them. So we're communicating and sharing resources in between actual sessions. Yeah, but I'm happy to like loop back and with some listservs that might be a good starting point for folks who are interested.
And Nikki, so with all of that going on and knowing that, like you said, anybody who's familiar with this and many other spaces in legal where, state legislatures meet and they have these high ramped up sessions that people don't think about it. It's not like, congressional representatives meeting all the time. They'll meet for a short period. Everything will go on and happen, and then they're out again. Are there certain areas, certain states right now that you're paying particular attention to? Is there certain things that have got your eye as a team where you're like, this is what we need to be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I mean, the Midwest and the South geographically are places where we're seeing much more hostile anti-trans legislation or just like broader anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. I mean, those are areas that are sort of like not difficult to understand why we are deeply red legislatures, right? That are moving to like pass anti-trans legislation and have like been really, using anti-trans sentiment as like a political tool. So like those are the places that we look, right?
Nikki, what would be for like, again, for members of our community who don't follow these issues or don't know about them, what would be like a concrete example of a type of legislation that's passed that then impacts the community and impacts your work?
Super popular. So in previous years, it's been bathroom bans, right? Trying to force people to use bathrooms that correspond with their sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is kind of what it says, right? It's like the sex you were assigned when you were born by a doctor. It generally refers to this like somewhat nebulous concept of biological sex. I don't want to get like super into like the weeds, but like bathroom bills were really popular, right? A couple years ago. This year, it's been for a very, very concerted attack on access to gender affirming care for minors. And that has seen some pretty intense success. And I will also say that like, I've talked a lot about state legislative sessions, but we're also seeing the rise of maybe, how to put this, more novel attempts to discriminate, right? So I think, if you look at Texas, right, with the directing CPS to go after trans children who have like received gender affirming care, right, to go after their parents. That's not a state legislative, like that's not legislation, that was an executive order. There's also, but like, the effect of it was actually in many ways like, worse because it happened immediately. TLDEF is actually working with TENT, which is TENT, which is an organization on the ground there to combat that. It's also looking at Florida, right? Florida Medicaid, Florida's Department of Health has released these two reports that are, how do I put this? Sham science, right? It's like putting a veneer of medical literature, or medical analysis over either like grossly misinterpreting a science or like the science of medical literature, or kind of inventing it, or deferring towards medical literature that like is bunk science pushed by anti-trans organizations. Yeah, so like there's, those are, but I would say that like more so than in any year in my time working, which I'm now realizing is close to a decade, as like, have I seen concerted attacks on the science, like the medical basis of gender affirming care and prohibition, like really explicit prohibitions. So Florida quickly went from the science is out for trans youth. And we were all like, yeah, they're not stopping there. And then like less than a month later issued another like medical literature review that was like, actually, all gender affirming care is not safe or backed by medical science, and should be banned, which is deeply ahistorical. And like anyone doing a good faith reading of medical literature would come to the opposite conclusion.
And so I think what you're describing then is, so when you're, I guess, part of what's happening, I think like anybody in any practice area, if they're listening to what you're saying, would recognize that the kinds of legislation you're talking about, or executive orders and these things, like in most other spaces, it follows some kinds of waves and patterns where it becomes a kind of trend to legislate or issue orders a certain kind of direction, and then you see that move to other places. Is that a fair thing?
Yeah, absolutely. There are robust networks in place. I'm going to name it, right? Like this is largely coming out of the GOP. I'm not saying that like Democrats are great on trans issues, but like we know that that states have that there are right-wing backed legislative and other sort of groups, right? That like if something works in one state, they'll do it in the other. So we see copycat legislation across the board. I mean, not only in trans stuff, but also like in repo rights generally, reproductive rights generally, like we see. So one state will try out a bathroom bill, and then 15 states will try that bathroom bill if it's successful, or even if it's not successful, if they want to make a run at it as well. So yeah, it comes in waves, and there tends to be broad adoption. Yeah.
So Nikki, what I know, one of the things we were going to talk about here today, and we'll do this before we move on and try to answer some of the questions that have come in. And by the way, I'll use that as a reminder to say, if you've got any questions for us, very helpful to put it in the Q&A. I know everybody's been putting in the chat, which is awesome. I'm going to try to parse through and look through that and make sure we get to those during the Q&A session. But if you want to put them in the Q&A, it makes it easier for us to kind of filter through. But I mean, what do you look at in terms of the future of your work, where it's going, what you're going to be doing, how you guys are going to address then this increasingly complex landscape? Like, what do you see on the roadmap for TLDEF and for your work?
Yeah, so I had, because I anticipated this question for this webinar, and then Friday sort of changed everything, and I've been kind of trying to figure out how to answer that. I mean, we are in a moment of like deep legal uncertainty, right? Like this is like a full mask off moment for SCOTUS, where we are going to have to change, or I think reconsider our tactics, right? I mean, I think we have to be a lot more defensive. I think we have to be a lot more careful about the kind of cases that we bring, because we are really trying to avoid getting in front of the Supreme Court. And I was like, okay, well, a lot of the work that I've done is in admin law, and I think that admin law is actually like an underutilized aspect of civil rights litigation. Like I don't see a ton of work happening there, and I think there's actually like a tremendous amount of potential. I'm also waiting to see if admin law really sort of is going to survive following the EPA case that should be decided by SCOTUS, which I think a lot of experts are sort of saying like might, if they're going to, if they're going as hard and as far as they've been going, might invalidate most of the administrative state. So civil rights litigation and administrative work are in flux right now, and that's the kind of the crux of the things that we've been doing. So it's hard in this exact moment to say what our future is, because I think it's fair to say we're in unprecedented times legally. We're in an unprecedented legal moment of a constitutional right being revoked. I mean, the Supreme Court has never like removed a constitutional right before, right? At least like not in living memory, like at least not in modern times, right? Like, and so there's I think it's difficult to sort of know. There is, of course, really strong conceptual and legal frameworks that tie reproductive rights and trans rights together. And I think, like trans folks show up for repo stuff like shows up for trans folks, but also it's predominantly around bodily autonomy and the right to consent to a procedure, to consent to and access medical care. So there's, I would say, like our futures are tied and are not separable, right? Trans rights and repo rights are inevitably together. So I think that there's, we're trying to figure out how to challenge this, how to, like, what tools are left that are viable, right? Hopefully, and it's weird to say this, but hopefully the administrative state survives, because I do think there are a tremendous amount of tools there that are underutilized, typically because they're like less sexy than like really great civil rights wins, which I think are really important, but they don't do everything. I think just as a quick, as a very quick, like we'll see states pass a prohibition, like you can't deny gender affirming care, right? Great. But then how health plans interpret that and how they administer that means that there's still exclusions that exist. And so then there's like admin remedies that need to kind of move in afterwards to actually secure like a functional right to care. Yeah, but I think I'd love to, is it cool if we get into questions? I feel like.
Yeah, let's do it. I think it's time. I can go ahead and start. I know that one of the questions we got in that I can go ahead and read out was someone had written in and said that they have a question in a recent Washington case when a transgender man had a baby and sued since he wanted to say the birth certificate to say man and not woman gave birth. Do you think we will get to a point where for HR and legal purposes, it will start saying transgender male or female on identification?
That is like, I wouldn't say that there's like necessarily a consensus. Some people are like their identification in terms like how they hold themselves out to the world is like a trans person, like a trans man or trans woman. There are trans folks who are it's incredibly important that it's just woman or man. The default, and I think it's like a good rule of thumb, is like however folks identify, that's what you refer to them as, and that like you just respect and honor someone's identification. Yeah, there's not, I mean, like, yeah, I think that that's sort of like, I would like to see I would say that like in terms of like the way that data and data system, most of our data systems are really are binary, right? Like are hard coded to a male female, right? Or maybe if you're lucky, an other. So I would say that really where most folks are at right now in regards to like data collection or the way the data gets recorded and displayed is airing towards having like a much broader constellation of terms that more accurately reflect folks' identities. Because our current data collection or just data schemes, right, or administrative schemes are very binary, and that leads to like undercounting or like, it makes bad data, and it makes it really hard to like kind of track folks are.
Well, no, Nikki, I think it's really important thing that you're noting there too, which is like something that we know on the tech side very well, which is things, I think people sometimes underestimate things getting coded into databases, like how deep and twisty that is, and how many complications come out of that, or what's all entailed in those kinds of systems, and like how many placeholders there are in different places for certain ways of identifying that once they're coded in, it takes not just a lot of legal expertise or technical expertise, but it also takes financial resources sometimes in different places and jurisdictions where even if people wanted to do it, it's a serious undertaking to figure out how you would restructure a system of data that's in place for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of somewhat jokingly reminds me of Y2K, which successfully we navigated, right? But like that was the Y2K panic came was like we didn't actually code in enough spaces in our programs, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, if you're engaging in the Social Security Administration, like those, like, and you're talking to someone and they're like, I have to put some, or whatever administration, I have to enter something, that the way that architecture has been built entirely from a binary, cisgender heterosexual perspective, right? Like, and so there are also like really great queer theorists who have like talked about this, but the ways in which like gender is encoded administratively or like administering gender, right, is like non-binary identities, trans identities do complicate or problematize those things, but it also expose how much assumptions are built in, as you're saying, into our record systems.
Yeah. So one of the questions, I know there were a couple different notes about this, and you already spoke to it briefly, but I do want to make sure we reemphasize or tell people about that. So if they're interested in, consulting partnership, if people want to talk about what's going on and how they get involved, like you said, I guess the first place people should go to is straight to your website.
Yeah. I mean, in like a sort of like self-promotion-y way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Right. Yeah. I mean, like, look, talked a lot about name change, very robust program, very easy to onboard. You can provide like a really fundamentally like powerful service for very little effort for some of our most marginalized communities. To me, that's like phenomenal. Right. But also, are you interested in litigation? We also have a robust pro bono program for doing, partnership around litigation. And again, I think, one of the things that we've seen folks who are like, this is an injustice, I want to help out. And so they'll take a case, but they're not versed in working with trans clients or connected to the trans community at all, or maybe subject matter experts around like trans rights kind of broadly, which intersect a number of fields, right? So I think that if you are interested, link up with a trans organization. My organization, we would more than happy to, right? But also like the Transgender Legal Center, Lambda Legal, National Center for Lesbian Rights. I'm forgetting a bunch. There's some great folks at various ACLUs, Chase Strangio, who I think you should just follow on Twitter. Actually, as a throwback, like listservs are great, but also to the young kids, Twitter has also been incredibly helpful during this time. Like Chase Strangio from ACLU has like, was actually like every morning during legislative, I would just pop open Twitter and be like, what does Chase have to say? What does Alejandro have to say?
That is an account I follow and read all the time.
Yeah,
Chase does. You're exactly right. Legal Twitter is really great. I keep trying to tell people it's much better than legal TikTok. I'm gonna put that out there.
Yeah. I mean, like, there are ways to engage in Twitter as a form of news, which I think is actually like shouldn't be scoffed at. I actually think and particularly like legal Twitter can be really helpful. And so yeah, Chase and other folks were kind of crucial for that.
And by the way, following an account like Chase's, you will also see other people interacting who will connect you to other information as well. So that is a really good note on resources. Yeah,
I think like follow smart folks who are also members of the trans community, right? Like follow trans attorneys like Chase who are on there talking, right? To know what's going on, connect with trans organizations that are doing the work, right? Because like if you want to help this community, like my community, right? But you're not a part of my community, like come to us, come talk to us. Like you have something to offer. You have resources, capacity, time, energy, money, whatever. Come talk to us. We can definitely slot you in, like we all need more, and yeah, also, I mean, even you can just also follow our newsletter if you want updates on what we're doing and also us responding to stuff as it unfolds.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we have any other questions that have come in. I'll take a look at the Q&A, but I don't think I see any others. Nikki, is there anything else that you would like to add today or to talk about? I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to me and helping us get this organized and giving us a chance to highlight one of our clients' work. Like that's the thing that really matters to us, is when people get to show us that they're, part of our broader community of clients and also doing really important work in the legal space. That's kind of what our jam is all about. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate you having me on and having an opportunity to talk. If there are any more questions, I'm happy to answer any more questions. I kind of feel like this is really a well-run webinar. I feel like I've hit my main points. Like there's lots of ways to plug in and help. And it's also like it's a wild ride. Like it's this is my community. It's something that I care about deeply, right? These are my friends and my family. This is my community, but also like, this is, this is of the moment, right? Like, this is like, we all sort of need to be doing, like, there's a need, there's a really profound need, and we're in a moment of kind of historical uncertainty around the law. So it's also, I hate to say this, but it's such a lawyer thing. It's also very interesting. Like,
True story, though, it is.
like, I'm also fascinated by the work that I do. Like, so, yeah.
All right. And Nikki, we had a question about the email in there. Someone had asked about getting in touch with you all. And from what I saw, the different projects have different names, but I know that Nikki is providing the information. We're also going to have, just so everyone knows, I think Annalisa beat me to it in the chat, but we're going to have an email for attendees with a recording and some more resources on connecting with TLDEF. So I want to thank everybody for attending today, everybody who showed up and gave us some of your day and time. And Nikki, again, want to thank you for joining. It's really a pleasure to get to talk with you about this, and look forward to talking the next time. So
fantastic.
thanks.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.